Hi, I'm Jason with SJC Management Group. It's currently May 2025 and there's a couple of new laws that just passed in the state of Washington that are statewide laws that are going to affect every landlord, property owner, and tenant in the entire state. I'm going to go over both in different videos, but in this video I'm going to talk about probably the most controversial of the laws, which is known as a rent control or rent stabilization. What this does is limits the amount of rent increase that a landlord can serve a tenant within a calendar year. It limits it to an amount of 7% plus CPI, not to exceed 10%. So what this means is in June of every year, a CPI number will come out that you can use for that year. If it exceeds the amount of that 10% cap, so in other words, if it's a 4%, you can't go to 11, you are capped at 10% max. If CPI is less than 3%, then the number that you could do a rent increase for that year would be less than 10%. So it's a minimum of 7, maximum of 10, and we can add CPI to figure out what the middle is. So for this year, for instance, the CPI number was higher than 3%. So the max increase a landlord can give a tenant is 10%. And this is for a 12-month period of time. The law also has a limit on the difference that you can offer a tenant on a month-to-month versus a fixed term lease. So if a tenant asks to go month to month, sometimes landlords would allow that, but for a higher rate. You cannot do a higher rate higher than 5% for that instance. There's also a statewide form created in the legislation that needs to be sent to the tenant. So this specific wording in the legislation needs to be used in your notice for it to be a valid notice of rent increase. In addition, it requires more posting requirements on the landlord to give notice to the tenant. Previously, you could just mail the notice to the tenant. It now also needs to be attempted to be personally served and affixed to the door and then mailed to the tenant as well. Now keep in mind the other legislation that we're going to talk about specifically deals with how notices are mailed to tenants, and there are new requirements on that that go into effect July 23rd, 2025. Now, the rent stabilization or rent control bill also has a notice period adjustment from 60 days statewide to 90 days. So it increases the amount of time that you have to give tenants notice that the rent increase will be going into effect. Now, this legislation does not trump local legislation. So for instance, the city of Auburn, if you're in the city limits of Auburn, there's a requirement for 120 days notice. Tacoma has a requirement to give 2 separate notices within certain time frames between 210 and 180, and then again between 120 and 90 days notices. So those are still in effect. There's also basically a 5% maximum amount that you can give in Tacoma. So any area that's more restrictive, those restrictions are still in place. It's just that the statewide restriction has gone from, or statewide law has gone from a 60-day notice to a 90-day notice with a cap on the amount of rent increase that a landlord can give within a 12-month period of time. If you have questions on this or anything property management related, please let us know. We're here to help. Thanks.